The following episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of suicide and mass murder. Listener discretion is advised. If any of the topics in this episode raise any concerns for you, please reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14. In the mid-1960s, a congregation watched Jim Jones raise his arms and say to a wheelchair-bound woman, "Get out of that wheelchair." She'd been paralysed for 8 years, and suddenly her legs began to move. Within moments, she stood, entirely unassisted. Jones commanded that the woman walk towards him, and as she put one foot in front of the other, the church cheered and applauded, believing they had witnessed a miracle healing. A few weeks later, a different congregation would witness the same healing. Putting one foot in front of the other isn't so profound when you are never paralysed to begin with. The woman was Jim Jones's secretary, and her performance was used to entice onlookers to join the People's Temple, a church which began in Indiana in the late 1950s. By 1978, Jim Jones had moved almost 1,000 people to Guyana, a country on the northern mainland of South America. On November 18, an announcement was made over the loudspeaker by Jim Jones himself. Not long afterwards, the United States military would arrive in Guyana and transport the bodies of the 918 dead back home. It would be the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Author and podcaster Jo Thornely has investigated some of the world's most famous cults and the minds behind them for her book and podcast, Zealot. In this episode, we're speaking with Jo about arguably one of the most infamous cults in modern history, the People's Temple Agricultural Project, a group whose leader would convince all of his followers to drink poison, men, women, and children. This event would become known as the Jonestown Massacre. The story of Jonestown begins with a man named Jim Jones. What sort of upbringing did he have?
He was generally known, perhaps uncharitably, as a weird little kid, but it was relatively meagre. And Jim, despite his parents being atheists, became kind of obsessed with religion to the extent that he'd even hold funerals for dead animals he found in the backyard. So perhaps weird little kid was kind of appropriate. He didn't have many friends, but he was really, really fascinated by religion and read books that weren't really his age group, like Hitler's Mein Kampf and the works of Karl Marx. So he was quite interested in a mix of politics and religion, in particular socialism.
And as he grew up, you kind of allude there to the fact he was drawn to socialism. How else did he align politically? What did he believe as he kind of grew up into a young man? What were sort of his core beliefs?
Based on him visiting a number of different churches because he was really curious about them and his intense interest in socialism, his prime belief was in equality for all. He saw the theory of socialism really catering well to that belief and that need for equality, but he didn't see it so much in the church system. He saw that the Bible might talk about equality and preachers might talk about equality, but he really didn't see that occurring in real life. He still saw mostly African American people and women as not being seen as equal by mainstream churches. So he became kind of obsessed with equality, and particularly, even though he was white, for the African American community in Indiana where he was.
And he founded the People's Temple in the mid 1950s. What did that stand for, and what was sort of the central philosophy of, would you call it a religion?
I'd hesitate to call it a religion, because I think Jim Jones took socialism and dressed it up as a religion, because, of course, it's much easier to get people to say hallelujah to something that sounds like an inspiring sermon than it does a speech about socialism. But at that stage, he did so much good. And for someone that, of course, as we know, didn't end up doing good, at this point, he, in the name of equality and helping the downtrodden, was helping people to get jobs, helping them with clothes to go to job interviews. He was helping people to get over addictions. He was helping old people find comfort in their retirement. He really did so many good deeds, and he was also instrumental in helping to end racial segregation in Indiana. So if you just stop the story there, Jim Jones would seem like the greatest guy that ever lived.
I want you to be like I am. I want you to become what I am. I want you to enjoy the fearlessness that I have, the courage that I have, the compassion that I have, the love that I have, the all-encompassing mercy that I am. I want you to be what I am and something greater.
And of course, the story doesn't stop there. He then began converting people to this People's Temple. What was his appeal, and how did he go about doing that?
First, again, he started just a little shopfront church that soon expanded, appealing to African Americans in the community. And then he learned a few different tips and techniques. One was from a guy called Father Divine, who was the leader of another fairly charismatic church. And he got quite into faith healing. And he figured, look, I can perform miracles and I do have this amazing connection to God, but I think just to get people in and get them excited about what this church can do, let's do a little bit of fakery just to impress people and get some money in the donation plate so we can really, really help the downtrodden. And he even went so far as to use one of these tricks, which was he would keep chicken gizzards and little cuts of meat hidden in his pocket, and would call people up to the front who perhaps had a tumour, or who he told the congregation had a tumour, and he'd wave his hands and say things and then yoink the chicken gizzards out of his pocket, and he would say that he'd just removed the tumour. And he would have people in his congregation who would pretend to be crippled and then suddenly be able to walk after he'd laid his hands on them. So real classic faith healing tricks. And that really worked a treat.
And what was it? The People's Temple was sort of starting to grow in the States, and more people were attracted to it. What made Jim Jones decide to move it out of the United States?
Well, he'd already moved from Indiana to California and found that there he had access to lots and lots of people who had loads of influence, politicians in particular. And his congregation became kind of a renter crowd politically. So he promised a 6-hour turnaround if people wanted his people to join their marches and things. So he won humanitarian awards, and he was even the chair of the San Francisco Housing Commission. So he had all this influence and all this power and a growing congregation. And he got a little bit drunk on that power. People were starting to investigate him, and there were some concerned relatives that were worried that they'd heard stories like the fact that Jim Jones practiced these things called white nights. He'd hand out drinks to the whole congregation, ask them to drink it, and then say, That's poison, you're all going to die. It wasn't poison, but he was testing the loyalty of his followers, and loyalty became an obsession of his. So some journalists were so interested in this very politically influential preacher and the claims that he was becoming a bit of a megalomaniac and some of his questionable practices that they wrote an article about him that scared Jim Jones. On the other side of the coin, Jim was really obsessed with the Russian side of socialism and the Cold War, and thought that the American government was going to start persecuting him for his beliefs, and that there was going to be a nuclear war. So all this paranoia from the article, the threat of nuclear war, and the fact that he thought the US government was out to get him because of his love of socialism, he decided that taking his group's compound offshore and to South America, the timing was right, and there he could have a lot more control over his congregation and dress it up as this agricultural utopia.
I've got the supernatural power. But that isn't the thing that we're going to have to be saved by. If I save you that way, it'll exhaust me, and then you'll lose a leader. Because I've got more power than anyone, but my power is dependent upon your faith and your willingness to serve others. Now, in this consciousness, we are expected to work out our own plan of salvation. We're expected to give of ourselves freely. As we have freely received, we should freely give. But it's amazing to me. It's amazing to me.
What was his vision for what it would become? So if it's an agricultural utopia, was he imagining that people would work on the land and that it would be almost like a commune?
Yes, he wanted self-sufficiency. I mean, he also did want to, as most cult leaders do, wanted to isolate his followers so influence from the outside was limited. But the actual vision would be a self-sufficient, socialist, equal, except for him, community that would show the rest of the world what was possible with his kind of political interests.
And how many people eventually migrated to Guyana?
He'd planned for between 500 and 600, but almost 1,000 eventually migrated. And the government in Guyana was socialist, so they supported him. And also, generally speaking, there was more people would leave Guyana than want to migrate to Guyana. So the influx of all these Americans they considered it great for their economy, and they really supported Jim Jones, and eventually made it difficult for people to leave Guyana.
And when people arrived, it wasn't quite the utopia that they'd been sold, was it?
No, the soil was terrible, and they had to clear a lot of jungle to get there, and it was just overcrowded. There were far too many people there than what the facilities had been built for. Plus, there were almost daily afternoon storms, which just turned everything to mud. It was so much hard work to get the ground to grow enough food for this many people that cheap supplies had to be shipped in. Plus, their leader was starting to become addicted to drugs and incredibly paranoid. So instead of a peaceful, loving community all working together and really reveling in their socialist utopia, you had people working very hard in the mud for not much. Jim Jones, even when he was away, he would record sermons and play them all through the day and night on loudspeakers. It wasn't a utopia. It was a really hard time.
And what were the living conditions like in terms of where they slept and where they ate? Like, I imagine that it would cost a lot of money to move a lot of people there. Were the facilities pretty plain?
Yes, most people were in dormitories, and there was a central pavilion, and a lot of it was open air, and it was super simple. And I mean, they'd built most of it themselves, and it was difficult to get in and out of the area that Jonestown was established. There was an airstrip nearby, but it was kind of rough going in trucks through the jungle. So they didn't start with the best materials, and it was very, very simple living.
If people who were there did sort of transgress or didn't abide by the exact rules of Jonestown, then were there repercussions? What were the sort of punishments that were perpetrated onto people within Jonestown?
When they were back in the States, it was significant that the punishments had elevated to just verbal admonishments to actual beatings in front of the congregation. By the time they got to Jonestown in Guyana, a lot of the people were controlled with drugs. There were lots and lots of drugs like Quaaludes and Valium there. And Jim Jones found that keeping people subdued and exhausted worked a lot better than any other sort of punishment. But also people there knew that Jim Jones had their passports. They were miles away from anywhere, and the Guyanese government was on Jim's side. So there was a little bit of beating, but mostly it was just keeping people chemically subdued.
From what I've seen, what was reported was true, and it wasn't good. Torture, abuse, deceit, theft, faked healings, drugging of people, punishing of children, the drumming up of fear. It was just one account after another of how horrible the United States was becoming. Concentration camps were being constructed for people of color. The borders were being patrolled by racist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. When that failed, the message was, well, nuclear war is just around the corner, and we were in one of the safest places to ride out nuclear holocaust.
And there was a lot of propaganda being fed to the people who were there, as you say, so that they would stay subdued. Who did Jones see to be their enemy? Who were they up against?
Who have you got? It was primarily, though, the US government. So Jones had fed his followers the line that the US government was very scared that as soon as people saw how great their socialist lifestyle was, that the pillars of capitalism would crumble. And so they wanted to stop that happening. So they were willing to persecute and kill the members of People's Temple. Jones had also convinced his followers that the CIA and the Guyanese government, even though they were friends, were not happy with them being there. So he was very good at limiting the amount of information that came into the compound. He would read them the news, but he would put his spin on it, saying that, the US were capitalist swine. So his followers felt that in the compound was the only safe place to be, because almost everybody outside the compound and people in considerable positions of power were ready to stop them and kill them if they left the compound.
Do you think that Jones was paranoid and that he actually believed what he was saying, or that it was a more measured means of control?
It's really hard to tell, and I think a little from column A and a little from column B. He'd probably started to go a little bit mad, and that wasn't helped by the drugs, and the paranoia that comes with the drugs means that I do think he believed part of his own story. But I think he was also very, very driven by a really deep-seated need to be right, to be obeyed, and to be adored, and for him to be the only person that knew what was going on. I think he believed that people were out to get him, but I think he really exaggerated that to his followers. He needed their loyalty that badly.
You alluded before to those White Knight rehearsals, and there's sort of suggestion that in the lead up to what would become one of the most infamous crimes in American history, there was another White Knight rehearsal. What did people who were in Jonestown think they were doing, and what was the purpose of what they were doing?
Because the White Knights had started back when they were in the States, part of their purpose was to get the followers really used to that kind of thing. It seems shocking to us that a group would practice drinking poison. But the more you're exposed to anything, especially in isolation without any other dissenting voices, the more normal it becomes. They believed that their loyalty was being tested, and that because they needed this group to feel safe and they needed to still be accepted in this group so they didn't get killed, they knew that they were doing something important. They felt like they were this groundbreaking socialist utopia, and Jones had gotten them used to the idea of revolutionary suicide. They were willing to give their lives up to make a point, to be revolutionaries. And while it's really, really hard for us on the outside to understand that, the situation they were in, cut off, they'd been drip fed this, I suppose, brainwashing, but certainly this really powerful message that they were the ones that were going to save the world, then gradually that becomes normal. So the purpose of the White Knights was to make this idea of killing themselves for a cause important, and their mission.
As these people were being radicalised in Jonestown, a lot of their relatives were getting increasingly concerned. What were they doing back in the States to try and protect the people who had left to join what was essentially a cult?
They were writing letters to their congressmen and just trying to get some political interest, because of course it was them being in another country, it was a diplomatic issue. So they were writing letters to government to try and get them involved. And there was one congressman in particular, Leo Ryan, whose political technique, I suppose you'd call it, was to put himself in the actual line of fire. For example, when he wanted to see how prisoners were being treated in jail, so he went undercover as a prisoner in jail. So when he'd heard about possible human rights violations going on in Jonestown in Guyana, he didn't just send delegates, he got an entourage together, which included some journalists, and went in there himself. So the letters from the concerned relatives had been successful in getting the right politician interested, and so Congressman Leo Ryan went over there, got in a little plane, and off he went.
On November 14, 1978, this Congressman Leo Ryan, as you say, got on a plane and travelled to Jonestown with a number of other people. What did he want to uncover on this visit? What was his primary purpose for being there?
He wanted to, apart from look good as a politician, and he was a good guy generally, he wanted to see for himself if violations were occurring. And I think he had a more long-term view to see if there were bad things happening there, if anyone wanted to leave. I think he really liked to look out for the little guy and save the downtrodden. So I suppose initially he and Jim Jones had that in common. But first, he just wanted to check that these atrocities weren't occurring. And of course, Jim Jones made sure that the members of Jonestown really put on a show. It was never cleaner or neater, and they had a big dinner and there was singing and dancing once Jim Jones had finally agreed to let Leo Ryan in the compound. And Leo Ryan was really impressed with what he saw, and he could see that some people were happy. And a handful of people had asked if they could come back to the States with him. And one of the reporters that he'd come with was even passed a note by one of the members saying, please help us get out of Jonestown. So he did start to suspect that all this was just a show and that people weren't able to leave of their own free will, and they wanted him to help. And he thought he was safe because he had some of his political staffers and a whole bunch of journalists there.
And when he was due to actually leave, he went to the airstrip, which is, the one way out. What happened once he arrived there?
More people than expected had wanted to come back to the US with Leo Ryan. So there was a bit of a delay while another plane was sourced so that they could all fit. And there had been, on his way out, one cult member tried to actually stab Leo Ryan, and he was unsuccessful because some other members saw what he was doing and stopped him. So once they went to the airstrip, as the dissatisfied members were getting on the plane, there was one, Larry Layton, who was really part of Jones's inner circle, and he smuggled a gun onto the plane and started shooting at people. And at that stage, a tractor truck also came out of the bushes nearby the airstrip with other members of the cult, and they started shooting as well. And the congressman and some of his staffers and some journalists were killed, and there were many other injuries as well. But Jones had decided that he could not let the story that the congressman and the journalists were going to tell get back to the US. He could not abide being seen as anything except an incredible man and a saviour and a revolutionary. So he thought that the only thing to do would be to kill the messengers.
Jones convinced thousands that their salvation lay in following his doomed attempt at idealism. Reports that he was keeping disaffected followers against their will there prompted an investigation by Congressman Lee Ryan and a team of newsmen. But tragedy struck when Jones's supporters opened fire on the fact-finding party as they prepared to leave. 5 were killed, including Bob Brown, a cameraman, whose partner described the scene.
I hit the deck, I lie face down. I have my arm over my head, basically, as though you go to sleep with a baby, One arm, my right arm was on my head like this, my left hand was this, and my face is pushed against, kissing the floor as close as possible. I don't want to move because I know they keep shooting. And next thing I heard, they walking towards us, one of the men. And somehow, one shot hit Bob Brown in the leg, I believe. I don't know what part of the body. He screamed, ouch! And of course, shit or something, I don't know what he did. And next thing I know, the guy came close and blew his brain off. And next thing I know, I say, oh, next one would be me who get killed, right? So I just didn't think about it. I just think about my little daughter. The next thing I know, I have tremendous pressure, explosion right next to my head, and my arm just feel like falling apart. But I won't dare to move on one single muscle. That saved my life. I guess the real save my life is because my arms is ahead of my head. So the bullet missed the brain and hit my arm instead, and I didn't move, and the blood is all over the place. So they thought I probably dead.
And following that, essentially a massacre of a number of people who were killed, what then happened in Jonestown? Because Jones was becoming more and more paranoid about what was happening. What did he then make the people in Jonestown do?
He decided that this was it, and it was time for the final white night. He convinced his followers that if they didn't commit their revolutionary suicide now, then people would come out of the jungle. The government of both countries and secret agents would come out of the jungle and slaughter their children. So he made everyone so afraid and almost infected with his paranoia, and he trained them over so many years that they were revolutionaries and that they were willing to give up their lives, that he told them that now was the time for them all to take their own lives. Some of them did speak out and ask questions and ask if perhaps they could go to Russia, because Jim Jones was a big fan of Russia and their government there. But he said no, he knew that this was the end for his group if word got out about the congressman. And so he convinced his followers. And there was distributed a large vat of Flavor Aid and cyanide and plastic cups and syringes for squirting this into the children's mouths. And he instructed parents to give the cyanide to their children first and for everyone to be calm, and that this is what they'd been leading towards their whole lives. And so over 900 people died that day, and I absolutely do not recommend looking at any of the aerial photographs of Jonestown from when authorities found them, because that image will never get out of your head.
Do we know if anyone rebelled, if there were people who were uncomfortable with this process and refused to consume the poison?
Yes, there were people that decided that anything was better than this, and they ran into the jungle. There was one remarkable story of one woman who had been asleep in her quarters. She was quite old, and when she woke up, everyone was already dead. So some people did escape, but there were armed guards in the compound that were standing there watching everyone take their own lives. And I think one of the details that I really hate is that after watching all these people, and that kind of death takes some minutes, after watching everyone, Jim Jones took his own life with a gun. So he took, at that point, the coward's way out. Once again, there was one rule for Jim Jones and a different rule for all his followers.
Was anyone ever convicted for any of the crimes that took place at Jonestown that day? Even the shooting, the guards. Was there anyone who lived who was able to experience justice?
No, which is quite remarkable. There's one member that went back to the States and gave a press conference to talk about why this had occurred and what their beliefs were. About halfway through the press conference, he excused himself from the hotel room where the journalists were gathered, went into another room and took his own life. And he'd left a suicide note explaining what their mission was. So anyone that could have been prosecuted was dead.
Did Jones leave behind any children, any family?
Yes, a couple of his sons were actually away playing a basketball match on that day, but most of his family died.
This has become one of those crimes that people haven't forgotten, and I believe up until September 11 it was the biggest massacre of American people in history. What do you think it is that we can learn from such a case of radicalisation and of almost mass delusion, I suppose, and the leadership of this one charismatic man? What do you think the lessons are from this?
Very quickly afterwards, any time a cult group got attention, people would say things like, "We don't want another Jonestown." So I think the Jonestown massacre really taught people how far people will go. Normal people, intelligent people, people you know and seem familiar to you, can go in that special petri dish of circumstances where, with isolation and indoctrination and charisma and fear, what a heady combination they are. I mean, many, many cults have existed since, but I think that was the first time that people realised the incredibly extreme lengths people will go to because of belief and because of a cult leader's tactics. And it had all the classics, an isolated compound, the charismatic leader, slow indoctrination, and an apocalyptic view of the end of the world. So I think we've learned how to recognise when that's happening in other situations. And I don't think there has been another Jonestown. There's been other bad things happening and other crimes committed by cult leaders. But I don't think we'll have another Jonestown. because we know what to look for now. We know what's possible. He took everything to the extreme. And once people see what's possible, you can take steps to avoid it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Well, not a pleasure talking about that, but I think it's important.
I believe there were some that did drink the potion. I believe that. But I believe there were murders because there were injection marks in the shoulder blades. And out. I mean, it's like 900 people. So, no, it wasn't all suicide. I've never believed that. I know there was reports that my sister fought, and that would be my sister. And she was one of, I'm sure, hundreds.
Even when my father told me on the radio that they were going to do that, I argued with him, saying that there has to be another way. I think the phrase he used was, we're going to visit Mr. Frazier, and that was a code for revolutionary suicide. We had to live and move forward. So that was my focus. The body count was going to stop. Yeah, literally, if I wasn't playing basketball, I wouldn't be sitting there talking.
Do you remember the sign that Jim Jones used to have behind his throne?
Those who fail to study the past are doomed to repeat it. Is that the one you're referring to?
What do we learn from that?
Don't ever think you're actually in control. Don't think that you are by some means given the right to control other people's lives. Nobody's entitled to that.
Jo Thornley's book, Zealot, is available online and at all good bookstores. We've spoken to Jo on the podcast previously about the Australian cult The Family and the woman behind it, Anne Hamilton Byrne. If you'd like to listen to that episode, just follow the link in the description of this episode. Just a reminder that if any of the topics in this episode have raised concerns for you, then you can reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, we'd love to hear what you think of the show. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts or send an email directly to myself and the show producer by emailing truecrime@mamamia.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and our executive producer and editor is Elise Cooper.